if we're going to talk about community and living lives that are for the sake of others, we must first talk about looking at life through the lens of compassion. Compassion is taking the burden of someone else and feeling it personally. Compassion is suffering with someone else. Compassion is personal. It is relational. It is deep. When Christ consumes our being, when He consumes every point of our heart, every thought in our mind, every movement of our body, when He consumes our being, compassion will consume our doing. And in this story this morning, we find 3 reasons why compassion is so compelling, why it is essential for us as Christ followers as we live for the sake of others. 1, compassion creates Christ-like action. Did you notice in the story today that no one asks Jesus for help? He is simply overcome with compassion. Jesus offers this mother unsolicited compassion. He steps into her story, into her suffering, not with advice at what she should have done to help prevent the past, but what she can do to help process the present. You see, it's important to also note that compassion is never passive. It is always active. Compassion is not about raising awareness. It's about being awakened to the need of someone else. And here in Luke 7, we see Jesus act because of the compassion that He is burdened with. He stops being a spectator and He steps in. He steps in to do something because compassion is not a spectator sport. It is a full contact sport and can sometimes get messy and will always get personal. Compassion that creates Christ-centered action on our part is not optional in the life with Christ. It is not negotiable as a Christ follower. It is not an elective. Christ-like compassion will always create Christ-like action. Number 2, compassion mends brokenness. Jesus heals the son's physical body and mends the mother's emotional brokenness. So the word compassion shows up 12 times in the Gospels. 12 times, and all 12 are either part of Jesus' parables that He is telling or speaks directly of Jesus having compassion towards others. And of these 12 occurrences, 5 of them reference touch. You see, touch also requires closeness. Not simply physical proximity, but an emotional and spiritual closeness. Jesus' proximity to this mother, to her emotional brokenness, to her needs, to her grief, draws out this active compassion that touches her son's body and starts to mend her emotional brokenness. You see, church family, it's not about what we say to someone in their grief, it's how we sit with someone in their grief. Number 3, compassion nurtures kingdom community. When this story starts out, you got 2 groups represented, right? That couldn't have been any more different. You've got one group that is walking out mourning the death of this young man alongside a widow, and then you have another group. You have another group coming that is celebrating with Jesus. They are excited. They couldn't have been more different. And when the crowds collide, Jesus is not part of the crowd walking next to the widow, but He intervenes. He steps towards her. You see, it's not about relating to the suffering itself, but relating to the person. See, Jesus sees beyond the funeral procession. He sees the one hurting. Nurturing a kingdom community requires that we stop looking with sympathy and start acting with compassion. Community is not born out of obligation. Crowds are, but communities are not. Community is born out of relationships. Church compassion needs to be a part of our everyday lives. We need to be mindful of it. Because when we're mindful of something, we start to see opportunities to let that play out. So what is our response to this call to be moved with compassion like Christ? 1, it takes a biblical compassion takes a sold-out commitment to Christ. So the question here becomes, are we daily allowing our minds to be renewed through Christ and His Word, or are we simply stuck in what we think is right? Number 2, active compassion happens when we actively listen. Church family, we cannot feel the weight of someone else's burden unless we spend time listening. And number 3, kingdom community starts to take shape when we stop forming opinions and start forming relationships. Jesus practices unconditional compassion. Why? Well, nowhere in the story does it say that the boy or his mother were believers, which means we don't get to just help Christians. We don't get to just show compassion to Christ followers. Nowhere in Scripture does it say that they pleaded with Jesus to heal the boy. Nowhere does it say that Jesus questioned the crowd about the mother's worthiness. Jesus doesn't form opinions. He forms a relationship. And he simply offers compassion. Unconditional compassion starts to build a kingdom community.